Hi.
Hi, Sharyn.
Hi, it's good to see you.
Oh, good to see you too. Good to be seen. Can you hear me as well as see me?
Yes, I can. You're a little bit low.
Okay, I can't really adjust the audio on my end as far as I know.
Okay, well, maybe it's me. Let's see. Diane hasn't shown up yet. Just want to let you know my Mohegan great-great-grandmother is joining us.
Oh, that's great.
I'll leave her aside.
Yes, I have a picture of actually Jeet's Budanaku flying bird, which was given to me years ago. It was painted by a Mohegan artist, and my good friend Melissa Tantaquidgeon gave that to me.
Really? Oh,
Yeah.
when she was alive, my mother and I drove out to, I can't remember the name of the town in Connecticut.
Uncasville.
Yes, that's right. And we met Gladys Tantaquidgeon. And
Oh,
I
yeah.
remember, hi, Diane. This is Joe. Oh,
Hi, Joe.
Diane.
Hello.
Hi, Joe. I'm excited to meet you.
Well, thank you very much.
Two questions before we get started, though.
Yes.
How do you prefer to be called? Do you Joe or Joseph?
Take your pick. I answer to both, including, hey, stupid. Oh, yeah.
No, I'm not going to do that. I know you're not. The other thing is, do you prefer Indian or Native American or something else?
The thing is, we all refer to ourselves as Indians and,
Right.
common conversation, and people have no idea that Native American is a term that wasn't coined by indigenous people. It was a politically correct term that was applied to us. I always say start first with your tribal nation. Yes. After that, there's a lot of different things you could use. And they're all more or less correct.
Okay. I prefer Indian too.
Me too.
That's fine. Diane, I told Joe that my great-great-grandmother is joining us.
That's so cool.
Wow.
Did you get my email, Diane?
I did. I only got it 5 minutes ago, though. So.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Me trying to. It's not easy for me to get through all the items of my day.
I understand. I think we all understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Join the club.
Yeah.
Those last minute ones are.
I'm sorry I did that.
No, it's not your fault. I was trying to figure out how to do something else with this Zoom, and I didn't get the information in time either. So between everything I was trying to do, I have my own 100 last minute items.
Right. Right.
So Joe, where are you located?
I'm actually in the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains, a little town called Greenfield Center. And this is where I was born and raised, this area. In fact, I still have the same house that my grandparents raised me in.
Oh, that's a wonderful thing. I grew up in.
I was going to say right now I'm in a cabin, which is just a couple of miles from the hill where my grandfather was born.
Oh, wow. So who lives in the house that you were raised in?
This is a cabin. The house is a few miles from here.
Oh.
This is where we often spend our evenings. So more secluded places at the end of a dead-end road, in the middle of a nature preserve. We have a 7-acre pond right out the door, and we take care of animals, and we do wildlife rehabilitation. So I might look out and see a flock of wild turkeys or a group of deer walking by at any moment.
Oh, that's so wonderful.
Yeah.
That's very right.
Exactly.
That would be an inspiration, seeing the wildlife, given some of your, I mean, you've written so much, I can't begin to start. but I mean, I can't start even thinking about it. I know that this is your latest. This is your latest book.
As Dogs, that's been doing very well.
Oh, good, good.
I was just talking about it. I was at the Onondaga Nation School out near Syracuse yesterday with my son, and that's one of the books the kids in the 4th grade there have been reading.
Really, that's great.
What started you writing children's books?
Having children of my own, and remembering that when I was their age, when I was little, I had no books that were culturally relevant, accurate, in some cases not even racist to read. And I wanted to make it possible for them to read the books I would have wanted to read. And fortunately now there's a lot of really wonderful Native writers, Indian writers who are writing for kids. And so it's really no longer a problem as it was when I was first starting to do these books back in the 1970s and 80s when I first started writing for young people.
Well, I have to admit, Code Talker is the one that I've read.
Oh, yes.
And it's wonderful.
Well, it was listed as one of the 100 best books of all time for young adult readers by Time Magazine, which is pretty amazing, with The Diary of Anne Frank and Catcher in the Rye and a few other very good books.
Joe, you can meet Chuck, Charles Johnson.
Hello.
Hello.
Nice to meet
He's
you.
also in the anthology.
Yes, I know. I've seen his piece. When will the book actually be out? I heard it had to be reprinted from you because
it had to be reprinted because my name is misspelled on the spine.
Oh, geez.
Oops.
Yeah, and I think the publisher also redid the cover.
Good.
Not the design, but I think she changed the color.
Okay. I'm looking forward to seeing it. I enjoyed reading it, and every piece in it is great. I feel like I'm in great company.
Oh, great. Glad you like it.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Hi, Eva.
Hello.
Ava, yay.
Hi, yeah. Good to see you all.
Good to see you.
Hi, Dr. Johnson.
Hello. How are you this morning?
Very good. Just hop off a Zoom meeting at 10 o'clock. So goes well, busy, but well.
Good, good.
And there's Jenny, who oh, there you are.
There she is. Yay.
Hello.
We waiting a little bit?
I think we should just start, and we've almost already started. So this is the Public and Global Affairs What's Next series. Sharyn Skeeter is our leader. And this particular session is Visions.
Okay, Joseph Bruchac, otherwise known as Joe, is an enrolled member of the Mohegan Abenaki Nation. He's a traditional storyteller, musician, and writer. For over 50 years, he's been creating a lot of literature and music that reflect the indigenous heritage and traditions that is featured and has been featured storyteller at the National Storytelling Festival and the British Storytelling Festival. He's the author of over 170 books for children and adults. He's won many awards. He has PhD. He's taught everywhere from Ghana to prisons to universities in the United States. And he is also a black belt. So here's Joseph Bruchac, and he tells us we can call him Joe. Would you like to say something about your story?
Well, I think I'd like to begin with something else. Let me give you a little bit of the sound of an Indian.
I'll have 4 years of experience.
Yeah.
So, okay. Yeah.
Well, that's cool.
Maybe if you mute yourselves, that would be a good idea.
All the studies on the still.
Please
Yeah.
mute.
Yeah, and then I
yourself.
figure out I'm like in the mindset.
I'm not going to mute myself, but I'm going to wait just a
No,
second.
not you.
This is actually a native flute, was made from by a friend of mine. And the flute is the song of the breath, the gift of the birds, the gift of the trees. And this particular song I'm going to play for you is one I learned over 60 years ago from a Pueblo elder named Swift Eagle, who was a very dear friend and teacher in many ways. A song to greet the day. Breath is one of those things that we all share. And it's good to be reminded of it as music does in so many ways. I think I'll say a few words about my story Vision, because it is a story that, although it's fiction, is packed with truth in a lot of ways. For one, my main characters are based on people I have known over the years. For another, virtually every event in the story is one that has happened to someone or a conversation I've had with someone in the Native American, the Indian community. For example, I bring in the fact in one way or another that in all of America's wars, Native veterans have always been there from the Revolution on. And they've always been there in greater proportion and greater numbers in a similar way that African Americans are compared to other parts of the population. And this is very interesting because when we consider that every Native person has a history which includes dispossession, the taking of their land, the destruction of their culture, and yet to defend the United States, our homeland, is an honorable thing. Whenever we have a powwow, the American flag is brought in by a Native veteran before anything else starts. The sound of the drum comes, and then the flag enters the arena. The idea that this is our mother, this land, this earth, is more important than any ideas of nationality or nationhood that go beyond the nation of living beings, which we are all connected to. So there is that built into that story. My two men who speak of their missing friend are Native veterans. One's lost a leg as a result of his experiences in a recent foreign war. They also mentioned the boarding schools. When they mention priests, and then say better murderers than priests when they talk about in their childhood being put into a youth camp, which was like usually a preliminary to prison. In fact, most young people of ethnic backgrounds who end up in reformatories or reform schools are usually on their way in the system that puts them into prison, the prison industrial complex of America, which is something which we often forget to remember, a very important thing. In fact, usually it's people who are disadvantaged and don't have the ability to read well. By fourth grade, if you're not reading well and you're from an ethnic background, you may be headed towards incarceration in the future. So these young men remember that period when they were sent to a youth camp, but instead of it being a bad experience, something good and transformative happened. But referring back to boarding schools, quite frankly, many of my friends, people of my age, I was fortunate not to go to a boarding school, but many people of my age went to boarding schools. And a very dear friend of mine, Doug George, told me 20 years ago how the boarding school he went to in Canada, he was Mohawk. Supposedly, all the kids talked about the fact that every now and then someone would disappear. And the priest would say, they ran away. And the kids would say, no, that person is buried out back. Well, in the last couple of years, they've discovered hidden graveyards behind every Native boarding school in Canada, often kids who disappeared. more people ran away from boarding schools than actually were graduated. And the whole idea of boarding schools came about in the late 1870s, early 1880s, when it was decided that it was cheaper to educate Indians out of existence than to kill them. It was costing about, in the money of the time, about $1 million per dead Indian in the wars on the plains. And it was a lot cheaper to create these schools, send kids there, where many actually did die. The graveyards of places like Carlisle were full of kids who didn't survive being in those places. But the idea was take away their culture, their language, their traditions, and teach them to be good Americans. The irony is that the boarding schools did not succeed, even though the trauma of those schools is still being felt by every Indian in North America, people whose families went to those schools. And we are all in post-traumatic stress syndrome as a result of that. I could say much more, but let me simply say that the irony is that Native people met each other, formed connections with each other. Some actually went on to higher education, became lawyers, and began to work for our people. So the result was the creation of a much more stable international, in terms of Native nations, international community in what we call the United States. And the boarding schools, again, ironically, were sometimes a springboard for intellectual development. I also mentioned smoke jumping. My two main characters decide to be smoke jumpers. That is a profession that many Native people have been engaged in for a number of decades. And some of the hotshot crews from the reservations are some of the most famous, fearless, and effective people at putting out wildfires. And that also is in the story. There's another aspect in the story that I think is important, and that is humor. These two guys are always teasing each other. They're always joking. And believe me, that is true of Indian life. We're always kidding around, joking with each other. They even make reference to my favorite new TV show, Reservation Dogs, and the fact that one of the characters keeps seeing a ghost of an American Indian who is actually the opposite of the stereotype of a Native person, even though he may look like that. He says at one point, the character in Reservation Dogs, that he was on his way down the hill to attack Custer when his pony stepped in a gopher hole and he had his thrown off his horse and broke his neck. That's how he became a ghost. But the idea that humor is there is something that often people in majority culture do not recognize in our indigenous, our Native, our African American, our Hispanic communities. This, just like Jewish culture, you had to laugh to survive. Tragic as it might be, there's always humor there. And as a dear African friend of mine, Chinua Achebe, said, he was my PhD advisor. Chinua said, the drum laughs and the drum also cries. And so it is too in our indigenous lives. So within this story, every page has something that's based on an event that happened to a real person I know. And I also threw in the name of a friend of mine, a guy named Dave Bruchac, B-U-R-A-K, real person, was one of my classmates at Cornell University. And he and I volunteered to teach at a youth detention center like the one I made up in the story. And he encouraged kids, Black kids, Puerto Rican kids, even a few Native kids to write. And my main character has become a writer, and in fact is writing a novel. And by the way, writing it in perfectly good English, not writing it in broken English, as many people still think that we speak. In fact, they even fool around, and at one point, one of them says ungawa, which is like a word you hear said occasionally in movies in the 30s and 40s and 50s, where you have an indigenous character, whether African or Native American, they're always speaking some weird language and not the language that would be spoken by real human beings. I think it's important to recognize that we have much more in common than we realize. And one of my aims through writing is to provide a window into other experiences that you can look through, that you can begin better to understand those people, those places, and those historical events that have been so often forgotten or glossed over. One more thing I want to do is mention someone I've already mentioned, my very dear friend, the late Nigerian author Chinua Achebe, whose book Things Fall Apart is one of the classics of literature, world literature, not just African literature. And Chinua told me when we were talking one day that had he decided to write his book the way he was taught in college, it would be a very different book. Instead, he wrote it in colloquial English, the English that is the lingua franca of the nation of Nigeria. And he incorporated into it stories, folklore, traditions, and bits of history seen through a native lens. And he told me one reason he wrote this book was there was a book called Mr. Johnson by Joyce Carey that actually portrayed his own Igbo people as uncivilized, as ignorant, as wanting to become just like the white man. And that book he had to read in college, and it angered him. He decided the way to respond was to write the story. By the way, Richard Wright once said that when he was taken down south and visiting, was treated Jim Crow, pushed off the sidewalk, came home, and as Wright said, he was slamming doors for about a week in the house until his wife finally said, "Richard, just write the story." And sometimes just writing the story is what you have to do. So with Chinua as a model, I have often looked at parts of history that were told through a white perspective. For example, there's a novel called Northwest Passage by Kenneth Roberts, which is about my own event, the attack on the village of St. Francis, now called Odanak in Canada, written from the point of view of European not native people, of white Americans who were the first Green Berets. And I know that story because I've heard it from the Abenaki point of view, including in our language. So I wrote a novel that was my answer to Northwest Passage in the same way that Chinua wrote Things Fall Apart in answer to Joyce Carey's Mr. Johnson. My novel is called The Winter People, and I drew on French and native traditions as opposed to just the English traditions, which are full of a lot of exaggeration and things that really did not happen. So I wanted to make a shout out to Chinua, and I also wanted to make a shout out to all of us who are writing in the shadow of history and coming out of the shadow of history and coming out of it with vision, with the ability to see clearly. Creator made us with 2 eyes and only 1 mouth and 2 ears, and we can hear 2 sides of the same story. We can see in depth. We can also look into our hearts and do that more than just talking. Actually do it in ways that provide us, perhaps, with vision.
Excellent.
You've given us so much to get started with. I think I'll go back to the beginning, if I can remember the beginning, because it's wonderful. I'm just curious about the schools that you mentioned.
Mhm.
Were any of those schools in New York where you were? I hear
There
from some-
was, yeah, in New York State, there was the Thomas Indian School, which many people who were Haudenosaunee of the 5 to 6 nations went to. And I remember sitting around the pot-bellied stove with my very dear friend, Dewa Senta, Alice Papano, who was the head clan mother of the Eel clan in the Onondaga Nation. And she told me 2 things about those schools. One is that whenever the people came from the school to collect kids, they would come in with a horse and buggy, a wagon, driving it through Onondaga, and kids would be hiding under beds. Parents would be taking them into the woods, anything they could do to prevent their kids from being taken to those boarding schools. Also, a number of Haudenosaunee people went to the Carlisle Indian School, the most famous of the Indian schools, which ended around World War I. And my friend Dewa Senta said some of them came back and they'd been destroyed by those schools. They became alcoholics. And she said you could hear them sometimes at night in the middle of town, walking down the street, singing the Carlisle fight song and drinking beer that they'd got by trips to Syracuse. So there was a lot of connection. Every Native community, quite frankly, every Native community in North America, that is in the United States and Canada, I should say, has had that experience of the boarding school. Either parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, and sometimes 5 generations of people went through the boarding schools. And the boarding schools really ended in the United States in the late 80s, early 90s. That's when the last of them closed or were turned into real Indian schools. For example, Haskell is now Haskell Indian University. and was originally a boarding school, and sometimes a very brutal one. And there are many ghosts in Haskell, and I could tell you stories about that as well. You know, standing in the gymnasium and hearing a basketball being dribbled toward me, but seeing no one in sight. People go, oh, yes, that's the ghost of so-and-so who stays here, died here at the school, was a great basketball player. I also should say that the number of boarding schools was immense. Almost every state had a boarding school. And if not, people were sent from that state to other states where boarding schools existed. Often they were literally thousands of miles away from home, sent to those schools. And a lot of kids attempted to run away. I've written several books, 3 now, about Jim Thorpe. I've done a documentary film about Jim, who's the most famous person who went to Carlisle, never graduated. And Jim kept trying to run away from school. He ran away so many times that he ended up being sent off to Carlisle because his father said, who wanted him to get an education, ironically, this way it'll be too far for you to run away. Although he did run away from Carlisle too, but that's yet another story.
Goodness. You have a character, though, despite all the bad things that you have mentioned, and they truly are. You have a character who actually gets inspired to write a novel in the boarding school. So,
yeah.
How did that work? Were some of these students actually encouraged?
Well, they were given instruction in English, and some of them were encouraged more than others. For example, you may not know it, but Marianne Moore, the poet, was actually a teacher at the Carlisle Indian School and a friend of Jim Thorpe's. He used to walk with her and hold her umbrella in the rain. So Miss Moore, as she called her, and she described Jim as a perfect gentleman. One of the earliest books that was published in the 20th century by a native writer is Zitkala Sa, Gertrude Bonin, who was Lakota, who actually went to a boarding school, and she wrote stories about the boarding school and about her life. And Old Indian Stories is one of her books, and she was being published in the early 1900s. Gertrude Bonin, Zitkala Sa, which means a red bird in Lakota.
Ah, okay.
And then
Luther.
Luther Standing Bear, also was Lakota, became a well-known writer. And Luther was in the first class that was sent to the Carlisle Indian School. And he wrote about that experience and actually said when they arrived at Carlisle, they had to be brave because they were sure they were being brought there to be killed. They did not know they were being brought there for an education. And they were put into a room with no beds, no heat, and they spent the night almost freezing to death, you know, wrapped in what little they had with them before they were finally released in the morning, and actually dressed in uniforms became the first class at Carlisle Indian School back in the 1880s. So there are a number of people who became writers who were boarding school, I'll say not graduates, but survivors.
Okay. You also bring up veterans, which is obvious in the story. Just wondering, and when I read Code Talkers, which takes place during World War II, I noticed that the characters were not in segregated units as the Black soldiers were, as my dad was. So I'm just
losing your audio, Sharyn. Got to repeat that.
No, I'm saying with the veterans in Code Talkers, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm seeing that the characters, the Indian characters, are not in segregated units as the African American or Black soldiers were.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, is that the way it was? They were integrated in the other units. That is
that is true. Native people, Indians, were treated differently than were African Americans. African Americans were constantly segregated, and Native were blended in. And that happened all the way through from the Revolutionary War, that there were Native people who served. In fact, someone who may indeed be one of my ancestors, I don't have a direct link, a man named Lewis Cook, who was African American in Abenaki, actually was then adopted by the Mohawks and the Oneidas and became a high-ranking officer during the Revolutionary War, and was cited by George Washington and accepted as an Indian, not as an African person or an African American. But there is a long history of Native people being part of mixed units, in that they were white and some Native Americans, some Indians, unlike the situation with African Americans. And there's also a color barrier that was broken earlier, and that is in sports by Native people who actually encountered the same kind of prejudice that that Black athletes encountered. They had things thrown at them. They had names shouted at them. Jim Thorpe went through that when he began to play organized baseball and then football. And the idea of the inferiority or the savage nature of Indians was often played up. And people would write articles about it, the racist attitudes of the time that you find all the way through into the 1950s and 60s, when someone who was Native is involved in professional sports. There's all kinds of caricatures that are still there. And so before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball, there were Native people, Indians, who were doing the same thing in baseball and football and other sports. But they often, when you went to a town to play a game, if you were Indian, you couldn't sleep in the hotel. If there was an African-American hotel, you could stay there, or someone might take you into their house, but you were not allowed into the actual hotels. This is in the 1920s, 1930s, even into the 1940s. So segregation did affect us, but not entirely separating us, as was true with someone if they were Black.
I know during about the same time, as I saw it, I remember seeing pictures of Hampton. At that time, it was Hampton Institute.
All right, Hampton.
With Indians there. I'm
Yeah.
assuming that was because they weren't able to go to other universities or other schools.
That is true to a degree. What happened, and I'll try to give you a quick history lesson, is something called the Red River War occurred in Oklahoma and Texas, where the Native people of the plains gathered together a coalition to drive out the buffalo hunters. They were not successful. The ones who were brought in to put down that rebellion, as it was called, were the Buffalo Soldiers. And in fact, a number of those Native people who were in that revolt, that coalition trying to drive out the ones who were destroying the source of their lives, were sent as prisoners of war to Fort Marion under a man named Pratt, who was the founder later of the Carlisle Indian School. And these Native men who were sent there, several dozen, to Fort Marion, were dressed in uniforms, given classes in Christianity and English and other things, did so well that several of them were accepted at Hampton Institute. They went on to Hampton for further education, and they were there with African Americans at Hampton. And what occurred then is very interesting. They were doing really well together, but the federal government decided, or powers that be, wherever they were, decided that you shouldn't mix Indians with Blacks. And so no longer were Indians going to go to Hampton. Instead, they had to go to the new boarding schools that were created, such as Carlisle. But there's so much in common. I actually wrote a novel called Brothers of the Buffalo that looks at the Buffalo War, as it was called, the Red River War, from the point of view of a young man who was a Buffalo soldier, a former slave, and a young Cheyenne man who was actually one of those involved in that coalition trying to just drive out the buffalo hunters, all based on very closely on history. I worked with people in the Buffalo Soldiers organizations and with the Native people in the Cheyenne community, teachers and people who were respected elders to make sure I got my facts right. And this, in the end of the book, the two main characters end up both at Hampton.
No, it's interesting. They didn't want the Indians and the Black people to mix.
Oh no, they were very concerned about that. I know they were a little late because, as you know, and I know, right from the start, Africans who managed to escape from slavery were taken in Native communities. Some of them were very, very, very organized. I mean, in some parts of the world, they created entire cultures. In Brazil, In Jamaica, the Maroons or the runaway people became very powerful. And there are parts of Brazil to this day that are still really heavily Yoruba from Nigeria. And I have Yoruba friends who have traveled to Brazil because they say some of the practices and traditions were maintained in those hinterlands of the Brazilian jungle when those practices were often kept down or maybe even disappeared in Nigeria because of colonialism. There's an awful lot of interconnection here, as you may gather.
And in music too, I think that there's some connection there.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Want to open it up to
Oh,
other
very
people
definitely.
who
In
might
fact,
want to say something. Diane,
yes.
you're muted.
Yes, yesterday I listened to a speaker speak about classical music and how they've done a big study and they've discovered that Indians are just as likely to be listening to classical music as whites, as blacks. It's not as we thought, or that they
Oh, yeah.
thought originally, that there was old white people listen to classical music and and that's your major audience. They discovered that it really wasn't like that at all. But in the course of that discussion, I wondered about the classical native music or Indian music and how that might be integrated with classical music, or if it is, and I just don't know about it.
Yes. Well, that is actually true, just as there were African American composers in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century who have been forgotten, just as so many women were forgotten. And I was actually involved with a good friend of mine who is from the Stockbridge Muncie community. And we actually worked on an opera, which is called Purchase of Manhattan. And he is a classical composer. I'm trying to find the exact location of this on my website. Cool. And yeah, here we go. And if you look under Purchase of Manhattan on YouTube, you will find a recording of the opera. And it is one that, as I said, draws on native traditions, but also is a classical piece and includes native music and traditional music. And my friend, whose name is Brent Michael David, is a Stockbridge Muncie composer who has been working combining classical and native traditions for many years. And Brent is only one of the people out there. I'll just mention him as a starting point. And in fact, jumping way back, I mentioned Louis Cook, the person who may be related to my family, we're not sure, who was a half African American and half Abenaki, born here in Saratoga Springs area, born here, who became a high-ranking officer in the Revolutionary War. One of his favorite things was to sing French opera. He loved it. He was supposedly had a beautiful voice, and he would give these recitations of these things he had memorized. So that's back in the 18th century. So yeah, we actually, I'm going to quote someone who is not Native American, but who is a Ghanaian. I had the honor of learning a lot about Ghanaian traditional music from an elder named Akpalu. If you know Akpalu, who spoke no English, only spoke the Ewe language, but he wrote these incredible songs. And the lyrics of one of his songs goes, "No person dislikes good things." And that means any good thing. It doesn't matter who created it. No person dislikes good things.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things in the story that I noticed, well, one among many, was that the characters have a lot of international references. And
Mhm.
I really
Sure.
appreciated that because it seems to be related to what you're saying, that
Yeah.
they were not just narrowly focused
No,
on their own people. They were drinking coffee of a
yes,
type that I probably wouldn't want, but at any rate,
yeah,
it was it was um, it was from another country, as well
yes,
as they mentioned Kandahar. They
yes,
also mentioned far away, and it's not another country, but Hawaii. They
yes.
have a
Oh,
lot
no,
of references outside, right? They have a lot of references outside of their narrow area.
yes,
And I found that to be really good because it's related to what you were just saying, that that all people should be interested in all things that are good, or
yeah,
good for them at least.
yeah. I've had good friends who are native coffee connoisseurs. They've had that kind of conversation about what's really good coffee. And, that's true all over the world. I remember once when I was in Ghana, and I was going out with a friend of mine named Wally Soyinka. Wally is won a
Yeah.
Nobel Prize for literature and for his drama. And we were going to try to find a good wine store because he really knew good wine and wanted to make sure we got really good stuff. We walked into this one store, which had a big display of wine bottles piled on top of each other. And as we walked by, all of a sudden, the whole pile of bottles collapsed and crashed onto the floor. And Wally kind of walked around it, looked over and said, an inferior vintage. We just kept walking. But that kind of sophistication is true of people who are from non-majority communities. I've heard it said again and again by Indians, Black friends, by African friends. We had to know more about their culture because they knew so little about us. So we understood them much better than often they understood themselves. And I think that's still true to this day.
Yes, I agree with that. One of the ways that comes out in your story, and as well as in other writings that I've seen of yours, is in the language, the way you play with that. In other
Mhm.
words, I think you mentioned something about the Onkawa thing,
Yes, you know.
and how there are assumptions there. The
Mhm.
assumption is that in this case, Indians don't know how to talk and
Yep.
say funny things and
Yes,
know everything there is to know in the story anyway, everything there is to know about nature, all of those
yes,
stereotypes. And
yes.
every time that comes up, you're playing against that in the
Uh-huh.
story.
Well, I have to say that description of them walking through the woods actually happened to my son, Jim and Jesse. They were doing a program for the National Wildlife Federation. They're both experts in wilderness and traditions and all these other things. And they're walking along and, identifying things. And maybe they tell the story about a particular plant or even sing the song that goes with that plant, because we have a lot of those things. But then someone in the group who was a real, you could tell they were a well-versed botanist, an elderly man, said, well, what about this plant? What's your name for this? And Jesse looked at it, and Jim looked at it, and they looked at each other. They had no idea. Of course, there are a lot of plants that are not indigenous, that were introduced from Europe, that are spread everywhere. In fact, we call yarrow white man's footprint because yarrow grows everywhere, but it wasn't here in North America before Europeans came. So Jim looked at Jesse, and Jesse said, we do not speak of that one. And we go, oh, okay. So that really happens. I said there's a lot of things in this story based on real experience.
I love that. Does anyone else want to say something?
Yeah.
Jenny?
Excuse me, I will. So last night we were at the Rainier Club. There was an FBI art crime discussion.
Yeah.
And one example that came up was a gentleman named Don Miller, who apparently with impunity went into Native American graveyards and collected arrowheads and all sorts of things. And one person from the audience asked, in this period of impunity, I will call it,
Yes.
he didn't really understand that he was doing something wrong. And so I just wanted to ask you, obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but I'm wondering, do you feel had you been writing 50 years ago, that it would be a very different environment for you now when you write?
I think it would be a different environment, but there were Native people writing 50 years ago who were dealing with these stereotypes.
Yeah.
My dear late friend Vine Deloria was one of those who, with Custer died for your sins, began to draw attention to a lot of these systems and stereotypes and things that were happening. When my dear friend Scott Momaday's first novel, Housemaid of Dawn, came out, won a Pulitzer Prize. We're talking about 68, 69. A lot of things were different. I actually have just written a book for middle grade readers called Of All Tribes, which talks about the Indian takeover of Alcatraz Island in 1969. And prior to 1969, things that were happening to Native people as a matter of course, Native communities, Native reservations were being terminated. Native people were being involved in relocation, which meant sending them to cities where they were supposed to get job training, usually didn't, and they could not get back home. They had no money. They often had to hitchhike or walk. Those kinds of things were happening with great regularity. And after the takeover of Alcatraz, things began to change.
Well, and
Things
here,
began-
Seattle Discovery Park was a classic example of that.
Sure thing.
Bernie White Bear and, the
Mhm.
armed conflict that resulted from that.
Yeah, so there are a lot of those situations. And by the way, we now have the Native American Graves Act. We have the repatriation. I've been involved personally, and my family has, with repatriation of human remains that were put into museums or into historical societies, even private collectors. And by the way, one of the most avid private collectors that I know of was George Walker Bush's grandfather, who actually, with a couple of people, dug up Geronimo's grave and took his skull.
And to my understanding, we get a Yale alumni magazine,
Oh yeah,
and there was mention
and
of
Bones.
that,
Yep.
Skull and Bones.
The Skull and Bones was found to have several skeletons of Native people inside their secret society, but they did not find the skull of Geronimo. It was not there. However, I was told by a friend of mine, there is an island in the St. Lawrence, which belongs to Yale University.
Like 2 miles across from my parents' house, Deer
Yeah.
Island.
And supposedly that is where Geronimo's skull is, kept on that island by Yale University's Skull and Bones Society and kept very secret, because this guy who was a caretaker told me he saw it. He said, you can never mention my name, but I saw it. And they said it was the skull of Geronimo. Anyway, that's the kind of stuff that happened quite frequently. And very often people would find that they had basically been treated as museum specimens. Even while alive, people were taken to things like the St. Louis Exposition and put on display. Geronimo was on display at the St. Louis Exposition, being an Indian, signing autographs. And that idea of Native people, of Native culture, of Native possessions, and even of our bones themselves being open to taking is a part of colonialism. And of course, all around the world, the British did that. The Elgin marbles is a simple example of that. Just sweeping in, taking things, Napoleon taking Cleopatra's needle and putting it, it ended up in Congress, in Central Park in New York City. So, and then human bones, I've been very involved in this whole question of repatriation of human bones. I was involved in the last repatriation from the National Museum of the American Indian of unknown remains. We didn't know whose they were, but they were repatriated. And I was part of the journey that removed them and took them to be honorably buried. So that question of the lack of humanity, which non-native people, which quite frankly, white European males in particular, showed towards non-white European males is actually, unfortunately, not including women, a part of our cultural history that we really need to be aware of and to prevent from ever happening again. Even though there are reactionary forces who talk about the good old days, let me remind them what happened in reality in the so-called good old days.
Well, we now have this FBI agent we've got his phone number. I think we should call and tell him about Geronimo
Yeah,
and have him go after it.
yeah. Who knows? I mean, maybe nothing would ever come of it, but it is an interesting story, isn't it?
When, if I may ask, how long ago was that story told to you? Do you remember about what year?
It was about 19, no, actually, it was about 2011. I heard
Oh.
that
Hmm.
recently. It was after, whenever it was after they had actually discovered and repatriated the bones that were kept in the Skull and Bones vault. So whenever that was, it was a short time after that. So I may be inaccurate in terms of my timing, but I know what was going on at the time that sort of led this guy to come up to me at a program I'd done, introduce himself, say who he was, and then tell me that story. I don't know if the story's true or not, but
Well,
that was,
Skull and Bones definitely owns that island.
yeah, that I know to be true.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is the time and place to really talk about the book that I'm writing. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but what's interesting is I'm working on a novel right now on my family history, which naturally has, been removed from their land, etc.
Yes.
As we all have, as you were saying, we all have. And what was so interesting, because my family was taken from, well, not taken, we were just moved from the Highlands of Scotland to Cape Breton.
Oh, yes.
And so that's well aware, and especially in that area. And what was so interesting is all of the historical documents that I'm reading and I'm finding in journals, and especially in the Cape Breton University, they've done a wonderful job at collecting all of these articles written during the time. Was when you said the words that open to taking, what was so different was when the Highlanders landed in Northern Europe, in Newfoundland and in Cape Breton, they were so welcomed by the Native American tribes.
Yes.
I've read that so many times,
Oh, yeah.
and because they were dropped off and they had to swim from the boats to
Yeah.
the shore, and they were left without anything. And when the Native Americans watched this happen over and over and over, they said, how could these people do that? And they took these people in and they made sure that they
Oh,
had
yeah.
clothes, and then they sent them off. It's like, you
Yeah.
can do this yourself. But that was so touching. But I've just read it so many times, and it is just such a moving part of the history of many peoples. So I just wanted to say that the phrase "open to the taking" was just, such an anathema. So
Well, the problem is that our traditional cultures, this happened again and again, are open cultures. And it's believed that you survive by sharing. So if you see someone who is suffering, you would help them, no matter who they were. Doesn't matter what the color of their skin or what words they speak, you would help them. It is your duty as a human being to behave as a human being. And that was the way that we were. And that is the way our communities in many ways still are, taking people in. In fact, I may have used the word ironically many times, but during the 1960s and 70s, when people were wandering out of America, sort of taking on the role of Indians, your hippies who were kind of like, nomads and so on, a lot of them would come to an Indian reservation, and the people in the reservation would take them in, give them a place to stay, give them food, and, take care of them. It didn't matter who they were. And what happened is that the Pueblos in the Southwest had to pass new laws, which were that no one who was not related or a Pueblo person could spend the night in their Pueblo, because so often they would take these people in, they'd wake up in the morning and discover these people were gone, and so too were all their jewels or their necklaces or their turquoise, having been stolen by those people who were given refuge. And a similar thing to that happened in terms of the colonies, because virtually every colony that was founded on the North American coast was given help by the native people who were already there. until people began to wise up and they began to resist because they recognized what was happening was that these people were not behaving as human beings should behave. And so you had to resist what they were doing. But even so, there was still, in fact, I would say that it is true that in virtually every Native American culture, every Indian culture or society, that one of the most sacred ceremonies is adoption. You can adopt someone in and they become part of your community. So much so that at one point during the early 1800s, a friend of mine who was Seneca said there were more non-Seneca Senecas than there were Senecas who'd been born Seneca, because so many people had been adopted in from other tribal nations who had, suffered loss, or even Europeans were adopted in. And what often happened in warfare, if a captive was taken among the Haudenosaunee or among our Abenaki people, sometimes that person would be adopted. They would be given a new name and clothing and a family. Maybe they'd take a place of someone who was killed, and they would often choose to live their lives out as an Indian, especially if they were women, because women did a lot better as Indians than they did as white women, where their lives were short and often brutish, and where they did not have any control of anything. Whereas in Native culture, women always had great freedom and were not slaves or drudges. That stereotype of the Native woman as being a possession is so far from the truth. I've often had it said to me that any man who doesn't respect a woman is an idiot and is going to suffer as a result of it. So there is within the traditions of our cultures that openness, that willing to accept new people. And that happened many places in the world. And by the way, your mention of what happened in Scotland, or even further, what happened in Ireland, people often forget that the British test marketed colonialism in various parts of the British Isles before they exported it to other parts of the world. I mean, they really tried to wipe out the Irish. So there is a long pattern of that process of exploitation and dispossession. And I think that what you described sounds like a very significant piece of writing. I hope you'll follow through and complete that novel. It sounds really interesting to me.
I want to extend this a little bit in your story. I get the feeling that animal rights are part of this, are part of it. In other words, if you can respect humans, you can also respect the other beings on the earth. And there, I think with the mention about the coffee that I wouldn't drink, there's a mention of how the civics are dealt with.
Yes.
And one of the characters says, I'm not going to drink this anymore because of this, because of the way they're dealt with. Do you see that too as an extension of the respect that you're giving to humans? It's also a respect to the animals and other living beings.
Well, I have been taught in many places by many people that the animals are co-equal to human beings, and often we are less than the animals because we forget our place in nature. But a bear never forgets to care for its young ones, and that we as human beings have a responsibility to the natural world. In fact, if you're hunting or fishing or taking any animal, in our Abenaki language, if you take an animal to use it for food, you actually ask permission before you kill it. And when it is killed, you would say, if it's a deer, may you continue to run. If it's a fish, may you continue to swim. For the understanding is that we're taking the flesh, but we're not taking the spirit. The spirit goes on beyond this life and is very aware of us. When I was on Baffin Island back in 1992, collecting stories from the Inuit people there, a hunter named Lukasi Nutaraluk, who told me he had hunted every animal on land and every animal in the sea, had great respect for them all, regarded them as family, told me this story. He said a young hunter went out in his boat, his umiak, to hunt walrus. He saw many walrus out on the ice floe. He began paddling toward them, and a walrus swam up to him, and it said, "You can take me. You have permission to take me." And the man looked at that walrus and saw that one of its tusks was twisted. And that man said, no, you're not good enough. Go away. I want one of them out there. He continued on. When he reached the ice floe, all the walrus they were gone. And that man never was able again to get another walrus. That's the kind of story I've heard again and again and again and again, that we're living in a world that is a cooperative world, that we live within it in a state of balance. That if we destroy that balance or don't respect that balance, we will suffer. We will not prosper. And it's in a larger sense that, overall world culture is going down that one-way street of destruction rather than always giving back in equal measure to what you are given.
I think Anne had a question or something to say.
Yes, I wanted to say thank you for validating that thought of the animals' rights. It's relevant to such a great degree on how we're taking care of our environment, but also I'm formulating a presentation on this subject, and it really helps to get this validation. We're quite arrogant to say we're the stewards of nature when it's actually the opposite. So I just wanted to say that.
Well, let me just show you, if this will show up. This is a picture of my wife and one of the wild turkeys we raised from a chick. And wild turkeys are the most wonderful creatures. They're so intelligent. They have such a big vocabulary, and they're such loving beings. And, people treat them as if they were mindless. And to me, any animal that we've worked with of all kinds recognizes when you're taking care of them and responds to you in that way. So I just say, from personal experience, I find the natural world to be a place you have to respect. You could get hurt there. But on the other hand, if you respect it, it respects you. We have a bear that has been coming every year at the same time. He's there now. We call him Barry. He's probably about maybe 300 pounds now. And we have to remember to bring our feeders in at night, or Barry figures it's for him. But the other night I went out and to take in the feeders, and Barry was there already standing next to the feeder like this. I said, Barry, no. He goes, no. He goes, jots down to his fourth and just goes back into the woods. Now, most people would run and scream when they saw a bear. And it's important to respect a bear. I'm not saying to do what I did, but that bear is someone I know. He's a member of our family. And, I'm not going to treat him as if he's something violent that needs to be removed from my environment so that I can be safe.
I think I'd be one to run.
Well, don't run from a wild animal. Not a good idea. That encourages their instinct to, let's go for a race.
I remember when I lived in Connecticut, there were turkeys who walked across my backyard. And it was always wonderful to see them. Just let them pass. Their territory too. Is there anything, I see we're getting toward the end, unfortunately. Is there anything else you would like to say, Joe?
Well, I think that maybe what I'd like to do is do another song for you. And I'll do this one with the drum. The drum we call in the Abenican language Pak Holigan. And Pak Holigan literally means that hollow object that reminds us. It reminds us. When we hear the sound of the drum, we remember the heartbeat that connects us to all other people and all living beings. The drum is the heartbeat of the earth. And also the drum is the sound of thunder, the first music that was heard above the air of this planet. And we, as human beings, we have to honor the drum and recognize it as a gift. So we often begin when we visit someone, my sons and I, the first thing we do is sing a canoe song, which would be sung from a canoe as you approached a village that was not your own, to ask permission to land. And then people on shore would sing back a welcoming song, saying it's all right to come and visit us. So let me for you what is actually a thank you song, a song that gives thanks. Oleoni Nidobak. Thank you, my friends.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a very rich hour. And I
Thank you
appreciate
so
it. I'm sure
much. It
everyone
was
does.
so true. Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you.
Beautiful, so beautiful, the sound.
Thank you.
So beautiful, your soul.
Well, Diane, the next one, the next event will be with Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni, and that'll be in about 2 weeks. So I hope to see everyone there, including you, Joe.
Well,
You're
thank you very
there.
much. If I could
Okay.
make it, I would. We'll see what happens. But in the meantime, everybody, Willie Pumpkiny, travel well.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Great to see you.
You too.
That was really wonderful. Bye now.